Toilets can be found in the corridor to the right of this room. We are not expecting a fire alarm test tonight, so if you do hear an alarm, please make your way to the nearest exit and down the main stairs. Once downstairs, please leave the building completely, as there is a dispersal policy, which means you should move across the road to safety. Thank you.
This evening, and we were very lucky that she came last year too. Valerie needs little introduction amongst this audience, but to say that Valerie is the director of the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology. She's worked on a huge range of diverse subjects, really influential within our field, adventurous, innovative, from China chic to queer style to Gothic, to Paris, in fact, which she's going to talk about this evening. So it's my immense pleasure to welcome Valerie. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. I'm always happy to be back at London College of Fashion. It seems like less than a year ago that I was here, I guess, talking about Pink, which was last fall's exhibition. And now we just opened Paris Capital of Fashion. This is an early version of the cover of the book, and at least one of the other contributors, Anya Rocamora, is here. I just did the introductory essay, and then there are a series of other essays which look at different aspects of why one might consider Paris the capital of fashion and what that means to be a capital. I'm going to talk to you today, though, more about the exhibition, which just opened and which will last in New York until January 4th. So fashion today is designed and shown everywhere from Shanghai to New York and from Mumbai to Sao Paulo. In fact, if you wanted to, you could probably spend every week of the year going to some fashion week in a city around the world. And yet, ironically, perhaps, despite this proliferation of global fashion cities, the big four fashion capitals, Paris, New York, Milan, and London, continue to be the dominant oligarchy and have been really for the last half a century. In fact, if you look at it even more closely, it appears that Paris has actually benefited from the proliferation of fashion design around the world, as in many cases the most talented designers around the world congregate to show their collections in Paris. So one of the inspirations for doing this show was several years ago, two of my younger curators did a show on global fashion capitals. And looking at Lagos, St. Petersburg, Kiev, and that got me thinking about Paris as kind of the big fashion capital. Another thing that got me thinking about this was a few years ago, some of New York City's most prestigious designers started to defect to Paris and to show there. And there was a lot of hand-wringing going on about what was happening that American fashion designers had decided to show in Paris. The New Yorker actually described Paris as the most glamorous and competitive of the world's fashion capitals. So I've been thinking about Paris and fashion capitals, and of course I had done my own Paris fashion a long time ago and then revised that. Then there have been subsequent books, Anya's book about Paris, Chris Brewer's book about fashioning London, David Gilbert and Chris's book about global fashion capitals. And I started thinking more and more about Paris as a capital. Then I happened to read a French book, Le Véritable Histoire de la Belle Époque. And that was tracing the history of the phrase Belle Époque. Because nobody in 1890 ever sat around saying to his friends, gee, isn't it great living in the Belle Époque? The whole term developed afterwards. And there's been a lot of discussion about what was meant by the Belle Époque, what years did it encompass, when did it start being used as a term. And so I read this book with great fascination, and I started to think, what about the phrase capital of fashion? And I just gotten a really lovely intern from the French Historical Society. So I said, why don't you go on the computer and see if you can get into the Bibliothèque Nationale database and just look for this phrase, capitale de la mode. And then he was clever and he said, how about other things like city of fashion and cradle of fashion? So we did a bunch of them. And he went through and I began to trace when and how that phrase was used. And it resulted in some very interesting discoveries and also a new way for me to look at the history of Paris fashion. Since I had just rewritten Paris Fashion, A Cultural History, I was kind of like, oh, how can I get a new angle? So this provided a bit of a new angle. So in the exhibition, the first dresses that you see are here, a robe à la française, and then a haute couture dress from the late 19th century. And in between a blow-up of an 18th century German caricature criticizing französische Modeherrschaft über Europa, so French fashion dominance or hegemony over Europe. And already by the 18th century, indeed already by the late 17th century, France had the reputation of being the capital of fashion in Europe. Notice I said France, not yet Paris. By the middle of the 18th century, people start to talk about Paris in particular. But prior to that, most accounts refer to it as France and say that foreigners all want French fashion. They are only interested in fashion that's from France. But gradually over time, the idea of Paris as a city begins to merge with the idea of the court. Now, Louis XIV's court was originally itself in Paris, but he hated the Parisians, and he moved it out to Versailles. So then you had, as it were, a kind of two-headed fashion capital, the court at Versailles and the city in Paris. The courtiers wearing the trend-setting fashions, and in a sense, setting fashions, and then the artisans in Paris making the fashions. And also people did have their townhouses in Paris and went to the opera in Paris. So that was also a fashion center where foreigners would go, and they would get their Paris fashions and then go to court if they were lucky. So you find that in the 18th century, not only are the French talking about France being the center of fashion and gradually Paris being the center of fashion, but foreigners are too. But foreigners are, on the one hand, they say things like, Parisians, every day they think of new styles to wear. A fashion that's 40 days old is considered completely démodé and was thrown away. So on the one hand, they're kind of astonished at this Parisian mania for new fashions. On the other hand, they start to worry about maybe this French fashion leadership is actually part of a wider French power grab, that the French are really trying to use the universal monarchy of fashion as a kind of thin wedge to have a universal French monarchy over everything. So there's this tension between admiring French fashion and fearing it. By the 19th century in America, you have a very similar attitude. On the one hand, wealthy Americans wanted to go to Paris to buy their clothes, and less wealthy Americans would buy copies of Paris fashion that were made in New York. So you would have, for example, there's a wonderful little poem published in 1850 called Nothing to Wear. And it starts out, Miss Flora McFlimsy of Madison Square has made 3 separate journeys to Paris. Her father assures me each time she was there that she and her friend, Mrs. Harris, spent 6 consecutive weeks without stopping in one continuous round of shopping. And then verse after verse lists everything they're buying. You know, everything, hats, mantillas, and veils, dresses to sit in and flirt in and walk in, dresses in which to do nothing at all, dresses for winter, spring, summer, and fall. They footed the streets and he footed the bill. So you go there. On the other hand, there were also a lot of Americans who were very worried about this. Why, as one writer put it, why are the daughters of Puritan ancestors wearing clothing created for the fashionable courtesan class in the wicked city of Paris? They needed to be liberated from this French fashion, which was suspicious because it was inegalitarian. It was from a country that was full of aristocrats. It was full of courtesans. It was Catholic. So in so many ways, it was a wicked city. And yet American women obstinately refused to be liberated, preferring to think that they might modify French fashion. So there, for example, you see a French fashion plate showing a little French fashion doll, which weren't really used anymore by the middle of the 19th century in the same way they had been in the 18th century. And then here, almost exactly a year later, from Godey's Ladies book, that same little inner scene put into another fashion plate created in Philadelphia. So Americans like to think that they took French fashion and modified it and made it suitable for Americans. But basically what they were doing was wearing wearing Paris fashion. And this was true in London. It was true really from St. Petersburg and Constantinople right across to Boston, Virginia, to Mexico City, to South America. In my exhibition, the first room looks at putting Paris in a global context, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But in the second room, I wanted to plunge every visitor into the sort of glorious reputation of the beauty and importance of Paris fashion as it went back for centuries. Because already by the age of Louis XIV, his finance minister, Colbert, allegedly said, "Fashion will be for France what the gold mines of Peru are for Spain." In other words, a source of economic wealth. So fashion and luxury were going to be the way that France established its economic power. And in addition, Louis XIV was very much aware of the soft power involved in setting all of the fashions. So his court at Versailles was the court that every other little tin penny king all over the continent wanted to copy. And everyone was copying French fashions, which in fact were already being presented, as it were, in spring and in fall, just as we have in the fashion shows, which recently ended. And Fashion Month just ended today. Here you see a really beautiful corset and set of panniers that I was able to borrow from the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris. And when you're putting together a fashion exhibition, you depend on the goodwill of colleagues around the world. So this was very precious, very fragile. Of course, we had to pay to have it conserved and brought over. But it really epitomizes for me some of what continues to be thought of as the essence of French fashion, that it's formal, it's luxurious, it's aristocratic, it's the product of a very adept artisan culture that in fact goes back to the Middle Ages. And I recently saw a newish book talking about how Italian artisans were lured to come to France and establish themselves in Paris to build up this skilled artisan group. So I wanted this fantastic two objects to be there in the show. Another important object that I really wanted, and which is probably my single favorite object in the entire show, is this fashion doll from the Museum of Fashion at Bath, one of the famous Poupées de la Rue Saint-Honoré. So before you had fashion magazines sending out lots of pictures which were then copied or modified in other fashion magazines around the world, you had these dolls which were sent out. Most of them were small, like this one is only about this high. But there are occasionally life-size fashion dolls, like the one you saw in that first caricature where there was a naked fashion doll being dressed by French modistes. So this shows the corset, V-shaped corset, the very wide court panniers, and although you can't see it in this picture, also a very long train going back, and a fabulously beautiful textile, and then further ornamentation. So this is the product of a number of skilled guilds the Couturiers Guild, the Weavers Guild in Lyon, the Modistes Guild, who put all the decorations on it, as well as lace makers, artificial flower makers, embroiderers, etc. Now, if we pull back for a minute, you'll see that next to the corset and panniers, we put the dress that's on the cover of the book. This was designed by Karl Lagerfeld in 1987, only a few years after he was hired as the designer for the House of Chanel. And it was from a collection that he did called Enchanted Island, named after a series of performances by Lully put on at Versailles under the court of Louis XIV. So again, emphasizing this idea that there was a direct line from the splendor of the royal court in the 17th century to the spectacle of the haute couture in this case, the late 20th century. And this trajectory is one that contemporary couturiers in the 21st century continue to insist on. One of the things we showed in the exhibition were photographs, for example, of Dior dresses being photographed for advertisements within the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. And in fact, we established, if you see the background here, some of the clothes from this section are in a kind of facsimile of the Hall of Mirrors in the center of the larger gallery at FIT. So you notice that not only is the name referring to the age of Louis XIV, but the very shape of the dress itself echoes the corset and panniers. We have this sort of gold and rich royal red. All of this looks very 80s now also. And it's significant that the 1980s were a period when fashion was really in fashion and when the Paris fashion world suddenly really recharged itself. Because despite this kind of myth that it's been uninterrupted from the 17th century to now, in reality, Paris fashion has had lots of ups and downs. And the first account that I found in that database that talks about this trajectory from Louis XIV to the present actually occurred in the middle of the 19th century. And the first reference that I found to the phrase capitale de la mode came in the later part of the 18th century, referring to Paris. So not one that's continued in uninterrupted, but one which has been created and then often recreated. Let me be clear. There's no question that Paris has played an incredibly important part in the history of fashion, perhaps a unique role in the history of fashion. But it's also true that Paris has been mythologized. Everything about Paris, the city of light, the city of pleasure, and this image, this myth of Paris, is one which has been constantly constructed. So although there have been many exhibitions on Paris fashion and on Paris haute couture, I think this is the first exhibition that looked specifically at the cultural construction of the idea of Paris as the capital of fashion. Now, another pairing that I put in the exhibition was to pair our robe à la Française, one of them, which is a particularly beautiful one, on fairly wide panniers with really beautiful brocaded silk showing ribbons with leopard fur and floral bouquets, and to pair it with a wonderful Dior haute couture from fall-winter 2000 by John Galliano for Dior haute couture, which was the one that I showed on the latest edition of my book Paris Fashion, which is a dress which evokes Marie Antoinette. In fact, on one of the panniers is an embroidery of Marie Antoinette happily playing shepherdess at La Trianon, and on the other side of the skirt is one where she's wearing a liberty cap and she's being led off to the guillotine. And it comes, of course, from Galliano's Freud or Fetish collection, which looks at dreams and nightmares of fashion. Now, another aspect of fashions of the Ancien Regime that's been picked up by modern fashion designers is menswear. So not just the robe à la Française, but the habit à la Française. And here you see a man's suit, a French-style suit, colorful, beautiful material, lavishly embroidered and decorated. And then in the center, a look from a collection about a year ago at Louis Vuitton, worn by a woman, but again with very elaborate coat, but here styled with running shorts and with sneakers. And then you can see also in the exhibition itself a coat not unlike the kind of coats that the Macaronis, the Incroyables wore in the 1790s. And then next to that, a sort of incroyable fashion by John Galliano, who looked at that period repeatedly throughout his career. Now, the incroyable and the merveilleuse are often mistakenly described as aristocrats and royalists. If you study the French Revolution, you know that it lasted 15 years, from 1789 with the fall of the Bastille to 1804 when Napoleon crowned himself emperor. The Incroyables, the Merveilleuses, are in the 1790s, right after, early 1790s, after the fall and execution of Robespierre. So during that period when Robespierre was in power and the terror was on, you couldn't dress fashionably for fear that you would be accused of being a counter-revolutionary. But after the fall of Robespierre, the jeunesse dorée, people who were young and had some money, wanted to dress up again, and they started to wear very elaborate clothes and started to hunt down and attack former radical Jacobins. So that's the style that Galliano and others have frequently looked at. And then you see, in addition to the Louis Vuitton, you see an early Alexander McQueen for Givenchy haute couture, which is somewhat unusual for him in as much as it's really historicizing, looking at Ancien Regime menswear and translating it to female haute couture. In fact, in the collection in Texas, it was wrongly labeled as being by Galliano. And in fact, one of my assistants said, oh, no, she had tracked it down, and it was Alexander McQueen. In that section also, we included this wonderful Adrian dress, from a costume from the Marie Antoinette film of 1938. Because the myth that French fashion was everything is not just something that the French made up, but this is something that foreigners, and particularly Americans, bought into very enthusiastically. So this is one of the costumes from his film, and it's one which was worn by the actress who was playing Madame du Barry. So I think that that's why she's in black and gold, because she's the villainess. And then next to it is Elsa Schiaparelli's cape with embroidery by Lesage of the Apollo fountain at Versailles, again, deliberately evoking the Sun King and the grandeur of the old regime, although only a couple of years before the fall of France. So you see sometimes this insistence on the greatness of French fashion comes precisely at moments when French power is most fragile and most in need of kind of emotional being bucked up and saying we are still the capital of fashion. Here you can get a shot of what the sort of shape of the room looked like, our miniature hall of mirrors, and how if you look through it, you'll see their dresses on either side of the arcade. It was a complicated production to create this because we had to get the permission from Versailles to get photographs which were digitally manipulated so that they would fit in this particular space. On another side of the wall, though, we have a section on Paris equals la Parisienne equals fashion. And here we find that in contrast to the late 17th and 18th century, when Paris or France was the capital of fashion for both men and women, by the end of the 18th century, and certainly by the 19th century, Paris became only the capital of women's fashion. And so men's fashion increasingly moved to an English model, and one which then was taken up by tailors in France and America and everywhere else. Not only was it simpler and darker, it's sort of in line with the rise of capitalism, the rise of the bourgeoisie, democracy, but also with a whole tradition in England that goes back further into the 18th century of the gentry paying attention to finely tailored clothes in simpler, more solid materials. And so there were wonderful quotes in French magazines, which would sort of begin with, in French Tailors magazine said, "Remember, fellow tailors, Paris is the capital of fashion and always has been. But these clever English tailors are making their ready-to-wear clothes so comfortable, and this is something that the great French artists haven't quite managed." So it's very interesting that on the one hand they're saying we're still the leaders, on the other hand they're admitting that in fact they're not really. Now, in addition to Paris becoming increasingly seen as the capital of feminine fashion, something that you can actually trace in the quotes, where it's a capital of feminine fashion, capital of women's fashion, Paris itself starts to be seen as being feminine, being associated with pleasure, beauty. Said that women will love to shop at Paris. Women everywhere dream of shopping in Paris, whereas men would like to shop in London. And London is seen as being grimy and a workaholic city, an industrial city, in contrast to the glamour of Paris. And in Miss Tinguet's song, Ça c'est Paris, Paris is explicitly described as a woman. Paris is a blonde. Paris is queen of the world. And so you have this long sort of idea that whatever the particular fashions in style at any given time, they're associated with feminine beauty, that the Parisienne is more feminine than women anywhere else in the world, and that, the Parisienne dresses and others, the provincials or foreigners, just try and copy her in their pathetic way. And stores would use this image. And in fact, the idea that the stylish Parisienne was not only the wealthy or aristocratic woman, but was also the working class woman. So the quote, half the women in Paris live off fashion and the other half live for fashion. But even the ones who lived off it, whose profession was fashion, was seen as being fashionable themselves. The little couturiers, the little milliners, even the little, flower girls were all seen as partaking of this femininity and fashionability. So this became an important aspect of the mythology of Paris. And then, of course, all of the various crafts that made up the Paris fashion scene included not only dressmakers, but in particular hat makers, as well as fan makers, parasol makers, and shoemakers, glovers, people later on who made handbags. So we have a variety of different examples of accessories which were always seen as being a crucial part of the complete ensemble and which had a whole history of artisanal ability behind them. So I still remember years ago one of the most beautiful shows I saw at the Palais Galliera was specifically on les métiers de la mode, all the crafts that went into fashion. And interestingly, some of the hat makers even started putting their names on labels into the hats, apparently before Worth started doing that in his dresses. Another aspect of this feminization of fashion was that over the years, other cities became the capital of menswear. London in particular for a very long time, but by the later part of the 20th century, also Milan. And so even when women's fashion took a masculine tinge, as you see with the Yves Saint Laurent pantsuit, there's this idea that menswear in general is drawing from London, from Milan, from Naples, sometimes from New York for a kind of gangsterish style. You do start to see, starting in the 80s, a number of the new French stylists like Jean-Paul Gaultier and Thierry Mugler who start making clothes for both men and women. So that's important. I mean, Gaultier and Mugler are both mostly known for their kind of very sexy, very theatrical clothes for women. But both of them were also leading designers for menswear who pushed the market there. And what you've started to see in the last 10 or so years is that Paris is actually trying to claw back its leadership in menswear as well as in women's wear, so that Paris Men's Week is actually one of the best attended menswear weeks in the world, whereas New York kind of folded it back in to the regular fashion week. People go to Men's Week in Paris in June, and that's important. And you have designers like first Hedi Slimane and now others like Kim Jones, Virgil Abloh, who are designing for menswear, often for big companies like Dior, Louis Vuitton, etc. So if they were able to get that back, that would be an amazing achievement, having lost leadership in menswear so long ago, and now perhaps beginning to get it back again, at least in the sense that the most prestigious and expensive menswear shows were in Paris. Even though Kim Jones is British, Virgil Abloh is American, the styles they're producing may not be particularly French styles, that's irrelevant. As Didier Grumbach said just a few years ago, he told Women's Wear Daily, he said, Paris fashion is global now. We cannot and must not any longer consider ourselves just French. The world, the designers are global, the production is global, the customers are global, and it seems that Paris is now perceiving itself as sort of as the apex of all of the fashion cities around the world. Now, the haute couture also plays a crucial part in the rise of Paris fashion. If you go back on the one hand and have the Ancien Regime and the court at Versailles, the second part that comes up in every story, every account of Paris fashion, is the rise of the haute couture, and in particular, the role of Charles Frederick Worth. You all know, being fashion people, English, went over to Paris with a partner, a Swedish partner. He established the first sort of modern grande couture house. What he did effectively was to transform the couture from a small-scale craft into big business. And also he tried to promote it as high art. Notice how he's wearing a beret, like Rembrandt, and he was prone to making statements to the press like, I am a great artist, I'm a colorist just like Delacroix, which at first made them all gag with laughing because, after all, he was no artist, he was just a furnisher of ladies' clothes. But after a while, with increased competition from other countries which were more advanced with industrialization and with ready-to-wear, the idea of the grande couture, which just meant big sewing, it meant that he had hundreds of women sewing at his atelier, and that he presented a line of clothes from which you chose. Unlike the little dressmakers, the little couturiers, go, yes, madam, what kind of dress would you like? Would you like it blue? What sleeves would you like? He would say, this is the collection that I have to present to you. Which one of these, my artworks, do you choose? Once in a while, for a very special client, the Empress Eugenie or Mrs. Vanderbilt, he might make something that he would literally think, go into a state of inspiration and come up with something. But most of the time, you chose a product that was sewn by a team of couturiers in his back room. So grande couture just meant it was a big business. But with competition, it starts to be referred to in the later 19th century as haute couture. It's high sewing because it's artistic sewing. And the people who are creating it are increasingly starting to see themselves as some kind of artist and what they produced as a kind of art. Now, there's already a long history of that in France. Mercier, in the 18th century, described fashion as a cherished art in France. So there's this history of it, but it's in distinguishing French fashion from ready-to-wear, mass-produced fashion that you really get the sort of emphasis on the haute couture as being what makes France special. Now, you have plenty of dressmakers who do custom dresses in other countries, but France was the first one that established this as a system. Initially, it was a system that incorporated both couturiers and people who produced industrial ready-to-wear. So we have here the blue dress there is a fairly early Worth and Beaubourg. The beautiful sort of icy blue dress in front of it is a Worth from a little bit later. The next one is actually a ready-to-wear dress from Au Bon Marché. Now, you could do ready-to-wear capes. You could even do ready-to-wear corsets in set sizes. But a dress like this that had to be fit over an individual's corseted body could not be sold perfectly made like this. It was sold partly sewn together, and then you took it to your little dressmaker at the corner to have it actually fitted the rest to you. But you had industrial designers who were creating fashion for the big department stores, and they were increasingly creating interesting and often very good fashion. The next one, which we'll see here, this was done for Mrs. Vanderbilt's famous fancy dress ball when she came as Electricity. And we weren't able to borrow her torch, but she originally had a torch that she held like the Statue of Liberty, which had an electric battery that she kept in it, and so she would light it up. And this presumably really was an absolute original that he made for her. But it's a big mistake to think that couture means it's an original dress just for you, madam. It's from a selection. And from the beginning, the couture saleswomen were instructed that they would try and prevent women who ran in the same circles from buying exactly the same dress. Moving from the couture into the more modern era, from couture and including designer ready-to-wear, we find that France also really builds on the cult of the designer. Worth, remember, signed his name on the labels inside his clothes, like an artist would sign a painting. And that, in that way, really emphasizing his position as an artist. Now, Doucet didn't really think of his work as a designer as art, but he wanted very much to promote the idea that he was a cultivated and artistic person who happened to work in an artistic trade. And so he was a great collector of art, of antiquities, and of fashion. So he was one of the people who helped establish the Society for the History of Costume in France and had really beautiful 18th century dresses that he probably used in part as inspiration for some of his own designs. Because already in Worth and Doucet's era, there was a lot of couturiers looking at historic paintings from the past and being inspired by that. Next to that, we have a little black dress by Chanel, and next to that, a black dress with trompe-l'oeil jewelry by Karl Lagerfeld. Now, the cult of the designer, as it's usually expressed in histories of fashion, is magic names of fashion. You know, it's almost biblical. It's a genealogy of genius. Worth begets Chanel, who begets Dior, who begets Saint Laurent. And they kind of, as though the rain along the Seine had geniuses popping up like mushrooms there. This is not how creativity works. Studies of creativity talk about how you need certain fields and networks where people come up with ideas and then have a series of gatekeepers who will approve them. So Chanel did not single-handedly invent the little black dress, nor did she abolish the corset or invent designer perfume or any of those things. She was one of a cohort, as it were, a regiment of women in the early 20th century who were modern women and who were part of a generation of modern women who thought that who better to dress modern women than another modern woman? In fact, male designers like Jean Patou, who did really almost exactly the kind of thing that Chanel did and dressed sportswear figures, famous tennis player Suzanne Langland, Patou was forced to complain to a journalist, men can design women's fashion too. You don't have to be a woman. But had Chanel closed, well, she closed her house in 1939. Had it stayed closed, we'd probably remember her only as one of the most famous of that regiment of women who worked between Poiret's harem and Dior's new look, along with her arch rival, Schiaparelli, a.k.a. that Italian artist who makes clothes, or Madame Grey, or Vianney, or Augusta Bernard, a host of other women. But because she reopened in the 50s, lived till she was 71, and kept telling new generations that she had invented everything, even so, after she died, the House of Chanel went into the doldrums. Only older bourgeois women wore it. It was because Lagerfeld was brought in to successfully, as the cliche has it, waken the sleeping beauty by giving her shock treatments. So suddenly the C's were supersized and the pearls were supersized, and he was bringing in leather and denim and all kinds of new materials that he was able to make Chanel relevant to a new generation. Because otherwise, without a valued successor, the magic names of fashion just fade. Meanwhile, what's been happening in America? So we go back to the first room. You have American designers who sometimes will set up with French names, like Madame Victorine. We have no way of knowing whether she was in fact French or just thought that having a French name would sell better, like calling Target Target. You also had lots and lots of copying, outright copying of French fashion. So this dress here is a really, really, really bad copy of Madeleine Vianney's famous Little Horses dress. And when that was offered to me for a very cheap price, I thought, we have to buy that. Unfortunately, the originals in Europe were too fragile to travel, but everybody has seen the pictures of the original. And the embroidery is so bad, everything about it is crude. Poor Vianney tried so hard, putting her thumbprint on her labels, sending pictures of her dresses from 3 different angles to the Parisian legal office to have them notarized to be hers, and it's still copied, sometimes by out-and-out thieves, like this person, sometimes by people who did high-end copies. The one next to it is a very high-end copy of a Jean Lanvin dress, really beautiful, almost certainly licensed copy, done for a New York department store in the 1930s. Meanwhile, there were American designers, such as Claire McCardle over there, and the other 1930s one. How ironic that I've forgotten her name. Elizabeth Hawes. Sorry, synapses clicked. Elizabeth Hawes. They admired the French. They both loved Vianney. They thought she was brilliant. They looked at her clothes, they dissected them, but they also both wanted to create clothes that were for American women. As Elizabeth Hawes said, there's this myth that all the best fashion is made in France and that all women everywhere want it. But part of that myth, Hawes complained, was that everybody knew the names of French designers. Whereas even in the 1930s, when they started to promote the American designer movement, it was just, as Hawes put it, American designers, whoopee, perfectly anonymous people, robots maybe. So they didn't have names. And McCardle had to pay extra to get her name with the manufacturers on the label. As late as the 1960s, Bill Blass complained, no one wants to know who the American designer is. You have the name of the store or the name of the manufacturer on the label. Although during World War II, you had the moment when American designers appeared, and I'm going to go forward for 1 minute. These are both French fashions from the 1940s, from the war years. Now, for Lanvin and Piguet. During these years, the Nazis occupied Paris, and Americans were really not able to get much in the way of fashion information. Sure, a few pictures came out, but they couldn't travel back and forth, buy toiles, copy the clothes, even go to fashion shows and sketch them. The Germans allowed Paris to remain the center of the couture. They had wanted to move it to Berlin and Vienna, but they left it in Paris. But they controlled it. And if you look at Paris Under the Occupation, which is a fantastic book, you'll see how, for example, 20,000 French women had special ration cards which allowed them, if they could afford it, to buy couture. And about 200 German women did. And some nationals from neutral countries like Switzerland and Spain, if they made it to Paris, could buy Paris fashion. But since the British and the Americans couldn't, they went and had to be creating their own fashion. So for a few years, American fashion really and British fashion seemed to be rather independent. But then after the war, the New Look appeared and took over immediately. The dark dress in the center is a totally illegal inspiration, inspired by Dior's New Look. The beautiful kind of golden dress is a licensed copy of a Dior New Look dress. And then the two red dresses in back, on the far side, it's a Jacques Fath haute couture, and on the near side, it's a Fath mass-produced, specially made with Joseph Halpern for the American mass market. Fath flew over a couple times a year, and working with Halpern, he did mass-produced fashion specifically for the American market. It was so easy and cheap to get copies of couture clothes in New York that some British manufacturers just went to New York to buy the copies to copy back here, rather than dealing with the French. So, again, part of what keeps the names alive is having a continuity with designers. So the dress close to me is a Dior from the 50s, which is a couture original owned by Lauren Bacall, who gave us a lot of her clothes. She was a real shopaholic. But then after Dior died suddenly in 57, you had Saint Laurent, you had Marc Bohan, you had Ferré, you had here Galliano, etc., and now you have Maria Grazia Chiuri. So you have this continuity, so the name Dior continues. And Dior was so big for Americans and North Americans at that time. My parents, two more unfashionable people you could hardly imagine in your life, they went on their honeymoon to a Dior couture show. I mean, you could just do it. You could just ask your concierge to get you a ticket. Some designers didn't. You have Fath here, and Fath is interesting. He was talented. He was sort of the crown prince to Dior's king of fashion. But as Dominique Veillance pointed out, he also was the couturier who sort of cozied up to the Germans more than anyone else. And apparently everybody forgave or forgot about that, because when he died early of leukemia in 53, 4,000 people attended his funeral. So then meanwhile you have Jacques Heim, who there were many, many Jewish people involved in the French fashion world, mostly in ready-to-wear, tailoring, furs, but he was one of the relatively few Jewish couturiers. And when the Nazis took over in Paris, it was announced that the house of Jacques Heim is no longer a Jewish house. It was going to be Aryanized. However, he managed to escape. He joined the resistance. He, meanwhile, had put one of his trusted associates in charge of the house. And so then when he survived the war, he was able to come back and reestablish his house. But many, many other members of the Jewish fashion community were not as lucky. Here you see a close-up of, close to me, that side is the couture by Fath, and this is the Fath Halpern copy. And again, really this is mass-produced for the American market. But what's interesting is that Fath was really insistent that fashion is an art, he said, and men are the artists. The only role a woman should have in fashion is wearing the clothes. And when he said that in the 50s, some women were like, what about Chanel and V&A? But at this point, after the war, the dominant designers in France were men. And that period in the 20s and 30s when women dominated it seemed to be history. Here you see, again, the copy. It's outstandingly beautiful, and it's hard to imagine that this was really mass-produced. Now, here you see, on both sides, two Chanel couture suits, and then in the middle, an Orbox copy. Orbox was a department store. The originals would have sold for around $400 in the early 60s, and the Orbox copy for about $40, so 1/10 of the price. And they held fashion shows in New York, and all the socialites went, and they say, the Chanels are flying out the door, meaning the licensed copies of the Chanel. So again, as David Gilbert talked about in his essay, the idea of Paris works across national boundaries in different environments. So wealthy Americans had been proud to go to Paris to buy couture, crossing the ocean. And now they were proud to buy their copies, the Orbach copies. Plenty of people were getting really rich in New York, making licensed or unlicensed copies of French fashion. By branding Paris Fashion City, people in other countries were also able to gratify their vanity or their pocketbook or anything else by becoming identified with Paris. Conversely, they could set themselves up as opposing the French dictatorship with a new liberating American fashion, or as you see at the Mary Quant, new liberating London fashion. So we have the Quant show, which shows her revolution in the late 50s and 60s at the V&A. In 73, you have the so-called Battle of Versailles, when 6 American ready-to-wear designers came up against 6 French couturiers, and in large part because of the panache of the African-American fashion models, everyone considered that the Americans had won the battle. Meanwhile, with Fath and all of the men in charge of couture, women in France started to find a place for themselves in aspects of ready-to-wear. So Sonia Riquiel in knitwear, other people in other aspects of it. African Americans who've had such a major impact on style were largely excluded from the fashion industry. And so someone... what's his name now? Help me out. Sorry? Patrick Kelly, thank you. Patrick Kelly went over to Paris, where he became the first African-American designer to join what was now a separate organization of couturiers and sort of admired designers who were not sort of mass-produced designers. The structure of these organizations would change over time, as would the names of them. So in the beginning, when Worth was around, it was couturiers and ready-to-wear designers and sort of ladies' tailors. Then couture broke off. Later, there would be various amalgamations. Meanwhile, of course, you have different ethnicities. So you have a huge Jewish presence in the New York as well as in the London fashion world, at first coming in as tailors, furriers, and then later as fashion designers like Mizrahi. As the idea of the designer gradually became more prestigious in America, more recently Asian Americans, particularly Chinese Americans, again coming in first as workers, and then as they became the younger generation wanted something more artistic. You have Alexander Wang becoming a designer. And so this is increasingly important in a globalized world with a diaspora that will support the designs of a Chinese American designer. Again, you see the continuation of names. So Pierre Balmain and now Olivier Rousteing. So two very different design sensibilities, but the name Balmain continues. Or again, Hubert de Givenchy, and then a host of other designers coming in after Givenchy sold his company, including most recently Claire Waite Keller. So you have this strange phenomenon, because when Picasso died, you didn't say Julian Schnabel will be the new Picasso. But in the art of fashion, you do have to have this sort of inheritance where someone comes in and works with the so-called DNA of the brand. And then again, over time, we have Lacroix, Claude Montana working for the House of Lanvin, doing couture, Boucheron Gerard, Phoebe Philo at Céline, Rick Owens, all with different stories, but all part of this sort of history of designers coming from different places and different backgrounds at different times and contributing to making Paris fashion a global scene where designers from many places are producing in Paris. In recent years, what's become important is not just fashion and art, but the idea of luxury. More and more fashion design in Paris is about luxury and heritage. And it's not accidental that the majority of the luxury fashion houses like Chanel and Hermès are based in Paris. as are the majority of the luxury conglomerates like LVMH and Kering. The Americans have never been able to come up with a successful luxury conglomerate. And although the Italians have a few, this is something that the French clearly dominate, and that seems to be an area in fashion as things become more polarized between fast fashion and luxury fashion. That, again, is one way that Paris has managed to stay on top. So, in a way, it's this reputation of being first, the first capital of fashion. Here you see a 1980s fashion photograph from French Vogue showing a model running across the grounds at Versailles. And here you have a contemporary Dior fashion photograph showing her in the Hall of Mirrors. It's a little bit as though Paris has managed to brand itself as fashion. Paris equals fashion. And therefore, because that's believed in a sense, it's true. The reputation makes it true. It's a little bit strange. It's almost like Tinkerbell and Peter Pan, where she says, believe in me and I'll live. As long as we believe Paris is the capital, it remains the capital. And although hypothetically you could think, perhaps Shanghai or New York or London will take over as the capital, but it's a little bit hard to see precisely how that would happen. These are cities which are known for other things. And again, because this idea of Paris as the fashion capital has a long history, as lawyers would say, that kind of precedence leads to a sort of lasting reputation. And in that way, the aura of Paris fashion continues to dominate. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was wonderful, wonderful content and wonderful delivery. Seamless.
Well, except for my mental lapses.
No, if you lecture, you know how hard it is to achieve that. So thank you very much. We've got time for 5 or 6 questions if anyone would like to ask one. There's a person at the back. Oh, Ben, thank you. I was going to do that.
Hi. In the beginning, you said that first it was all about France being the capital of fashion and then moved into Paris. Was that just media, or was there some sort of manufacturing move that happened that led in the media or whatever?
It was both a reality and a function of media, so that you had such a mass of artisans and stylish people in and around Paris that foreigners started to go there, and foreigners started to think that the very word mode meant fashionable clothes. And that in other countries, if you were wearing fashionable clothes, you were wearing French fashion. Otherwise, you were wearing a regional costume. And so the very word for fashion became associated with France. It was a way of making money, but it was also a form of soft power. And you can see how history played a role, because France was the most powerful country in 17th century Europe, the most populous and powerful. Italy had started at least as early, if not earlier than France, but Italy didn't become a united nation state till late in the 19th century. So it was always broken up. There were multiple fashion cities: Florence, Venice, Turin, Rome. Only very late in the game, in the 1970s, did Milan pull out ahead. So for a variety of political, economic, and cultural reasons, Paris ended up being the capital there. Now, Walter Benjamin said Paris was the capital of the 19th century, but that's not true. London would have a much better case to be the capital of the 19th century. Britain had a far bigger empire, was far more advanced industrially, and London was more populous and rich. But Paris held on to this prestige of feminine beauty, art, and luxury. So they kept on being the capital of fashion, and for a long time the capital of art. Remember, they only lost that after World War II. So it's possible to become a capital of one thing and then lose being a capital of another.
Hi. Is there a reason you chose to exclude what you would associate as Regency fashion with Empress Josephine and your pure waste?
Only in the interest of keeping this within any kind of a short period of time. Of course, you're quite right. There was a very interesting period when London and Paris were influencing each other. And in the book, I mentioned briefly about how this London-Paris exchange of fashion was very important. But at that point, London was the other fashion capital. Paris was still dominant, but London was known for its shopping, had much more sophisticated shops in many ways than Paris did. And as I said, the menswear was already taking the lead by 1760. Another question.
Thank you, Valerie. I'm Jenna from the Centre for Fashion Curation. I've just wondered, the demythologizing or the examining the mythology of fashion cities, did that impact at all on your planning to present the story of one fashion capital in another? And although the visitors at the Museum of FIT are not necessarily New Yorkers, I'm a New Yorker, so I wonder about that.
Well, that's part of the reason why the first room, where I try and set it in a global context, to compare it to New York, and specifically say, fashion's produced and shown in so many of these countries, Shanghai to New York. So how come, since New York, as I say, is the capital of fashion for America, how come it didn't become the capital of fashion for the world? Because it never had that position. I worried about that, actually. Someone said to me, wow, you were brave opening your show the night before New York Fashion Week opened.
Mine isn't actually a question, but what interests me was that when Oscar Larrenta was offered Balmain, he was asked why. And he said, in New York, if I ask for red silk chiffon, in a day I get 3. In Paris, in an hour, I get 30.
Yeah.
And I think it's the fournisseur, the provisions, I don't know, but you were talking all the way through when you kept going back to the fabrics and the people that support it,
yes,
and the petit main, and that, they have never, ever lost it or let it go.
They haven't, but it's losing.
Yeah.
It is disappearing. Young people tend not to want to learn to become embroiderers or plumiers. And so that is very fragile. All those métiers are very, very fragile, and often, although people don't say anything about it, are outsourced to India or elsewhere.
Of course. But I think with the Arts et Métiers,
yes,
that Chanel has bought.
Yes, they've kept it alive.
I think that would never happen anywhere else.
No, you certainly can't find any of that material in the U.S. You forget about it. You will not find it.
If we have one more question, and then Valerie's going to be here
signing my book.
signing her books. And it also means if you don't want to shout out a question, but you'd really like to ask her something quietly, you can. So one more question? Helen here.
Do you think Paris would have been as dominant as a fashion capital without the fashion press?
I'm sorry, without the fashion press?
Yeah.
No. I think that the role of the fashion press has been very important. As one American journalist put it, the sycophantic fashion press, which is always worshipped at the shrine of Paris. And you definitely see that in American and British papers. So there's this tension between the sort of worshipfulness toward Paris and also the resentment towards Paris. Absolutely. But you still see it on the internet as well with influencers. And whoever's in the fact that so many designers want to show in Paris, even if they make their stuff back, in Italy, say, like Rick Owens does, or back in the United States, to show in Paris means you have all the journalists, you have all the editors, you have all the buyers from department stores. Believe me, those people do not all come to New York or London. They often go to Milan, and then they definitely come to Paris, but they tend to skip New York. That's why Tom Ford is trying desperately to fly them in so that more journalists will come to New York, because they were just skipping it.
If we could just thank Valerie again, and then...
Thank you
so much.
Thanks so much.
So if you'd like Valerie to buy a signed copy of her book, you can.